Hello, I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to Fiftyfaces TV. Today we're going to speak about sovereign wealth funds and what makes a successful one. We're joined here by Eugene O'Callaghan, who is former director of the Irish Strategic Investment Fund, and he's now a business consultant. Welcome, Eugene. Great to see you here.
Great to talk to you as well, Ethan.
Well, you've recently written a chapter of a book designed for the British Sovereign Wealth Fund experience, where you speak about the importance of flexibility and how the Irish Sovereign Wealth Fund evolved against a changing backdrop. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I think looking back on my years in ISIF and the National Pensions Reserve Fund previously, this concept of flexibility has been possibly the most important feature of the fund that has added value. And this is really because the strategic needs of the owners of the money can change. They can legitimately change. And, there are big things happening externally. Macroeconomic drivers change. And so the needs of government from these sovereign funds can change. And if that's the case, I think the sovereign funds ideally should have the flexibility to adapt and be more meaningfully deployed in the interests of the citizens.
And what was the particular experience of the Irish Sovereign Wealth Fund against the changing backdrops that it faced?
Yeah, well, originally the National Pensions Reserve Fund was a classic future generations fund invested globally. And when the financial crisis hit in about 2009, a significant chunk of that fund was used in a period of crisis to recapitalize the two main Irish banks, which essentially had gone bust at the time. And then as the financial crisis settled, and the impact of the primary needs of the fund were able to be evolved and moved on. And government decided, because there was a shortage of capital in Ireland post the crisis, to convert the National Pensions Reserve Fund into the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, which was to invest commercially to support economic activity and employment in Ireland. And that fund became operative in 2014. And by 2018, the economy had recovered a lot faster than people had expected. And so there was a version 2.0 of the ISIF strategy, which needed further adaptation within the fund to reflect, more capital was available from the private sector by that point. And then past that, in 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit, very quickly, the ISIF was able to set up a pandemic stabilization and recovery fund to help, the national effort to deal with the COVID crisis in an economic sense. So all of those changes happened during the period. And most recently, last year, government surpluses are now very strong. And government has announced the intention to establish two further portfolios. One is like the original NPRF, a future generations fund, and the second one is a fund to ensure that there will be enough capital available to invest in infrastructure and climate change projects, over the medium term. So, the world has legitimately changed for Ireland significantly, both downwards and then upwards through the last 15 to 20 years. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund, has had to adapt to that along that journey.
And of course, one of the dangers of a sovereign wealth fund is that the prevailing administration treats them like a private war chest. And political influence can often be a factor. And we've seen this recently with the Norwegian situation around private equity investments. How would you suggest a course is steered to avoid having this become a distraction?
Yeah, I think the first point is that the mandate needs to be very clearly defined, and it should be, a medium-term or longer-term mandate, acknowledging that, there can be, if there are big changes in the macro environment like I've just described, the mandate might need to be evolved or changed. But the key starting point is that everybody is crystal clear on the objectives for the fund. And then there needs to be, the main factor then is around governance, to make sure that the governance, certainly in our experience, what worked very well was that the governance comprised people who were expert in finance and business and investment and capital markets. And so bringing that expertise to bear, and there were, at least 2 layers of insulation from the political arena. And, so it's really around structuring the governance to make sure that the owners of the money, who are the politicians, can set the mandate, and also should obviously be happy with the strategy that the fund is going to follow. But individual decision making should always be insulated from political influence by the governments. So they're probably the big factors.
And would you say there's a difference in terms of the role and building of a sovereign wealth fund, depending on whether a country is high income or low income?
Typically, the needs are different, and ultimately, it's really important to specify the objectives for a sovereign wealth fund consistent with the strategic needs of the country in question. So, high income countries with well-developed capital markets typically will have different needs from low income countries where there are much less developed capital markets. And so, what is generally observed is that the higher your income and the more developed your capital markets, the more global typically the sovereign wealth fund will be investing. And the lower the income in the country and the less well-developed capital markets, the more there is value to the country in a professional, well-managed sovereign fund investing in the domestic economy. I think that's a general trend. But in Ireland's case, the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, even though Ireland is a high-income country, was set up at a time of severe difficulty when capital markets were very constrained. And so that was a valid reason to emphasise the strategic investment fund nature of the ISIF, and that, of course, then has evolved over time since then as the economic conditions have shifted.
What would you say were some of the observations there about maybe the tendency for things to correct themselves and not to need to make overcorrection in the running of a fund?
Yeah, I suppose what surprised me at the end compared to at the start was how much change there was, how much valid change there was in the sort of strategy and operation of the fund over 16 years. I worked with the fund, and perhaps more at a portfolio level. What I felt was really important was to have liquid assets, significant liquid assets on hand to enable this flexibility. It doesn't need to be cash or treasury bills, but assets that could be sold, because the new needs of funds usually don't materialize today or tomorrow. They take a number of years for the cash flow needs to actually be drawn down if you're changing strategy. So you usually have enough time, if you have reasonably liquid assets, to sell them at reasonable valuations as you're navigating that journey. So it's probably the portfolio lesson is not to tie up too much of the portfolio in illiquid assets, but it's fine to tie up a lot of the portfolio in real assets, and in certainly in liquid assets, return that will earn reasonable returns, not just cash, if you like.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Eugene. Great to see you here. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Great, Ethan. Thanks very much.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to 50 Faces TV. For more about sovereign wealth funds and other aspects of investing, you can both listen to Eugene's podcast as well as hundreds of other podcasts on our hub, 50faceshub.com.